Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here, as always, with my friend, colleague, and co-host, and his dog, Mr. Tim O'Toole. What is up, Tim, on this lovely Tuesday morning? How are you?
How's it going, Brian? I've got a dog who's really hyped up right now, but I think he'll
very excited to talk about Belarus, to talk about JCPOA 2.0. He's got a lot of thoughts, so
he's having a hard time containing himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe we'll put him back to sleep when we start talking.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome everybody to the latest episode of Embargoed. Thank you for joining once again. We are recording this on Tuesday, May 25th. This is going up just before Memorial Day weekend in the US. So for anybody who's listening to this either before or just after Memorial Day weekend, we hope you had a good long weekend. Welcome back. As always, thank you for the feedback and comments on the most recent episode. We appreciate it. We have a good episode today. We have sort of a pretty compact episode, about half a dozen topics we're going to hit and run through a few things that are on the cusp, but not quite fully fleshed out yet. So we're going to touch on a few of those and a couple of recent developments that have come up in the prior and just in the past couple of days, which is a good thing. We waited till Tuesday to record this, so we have a lot to get through and an interesting show for today. So just before we get started, of course, we are not here giving legal advice. We're not discussing any confidential information. As always, any opinions or thoughts that you hear on the program are solely mine and Tim's. If you don't like them, blame us. And of course, if you are a fan of the pod, please subscribe. Please leave us a rating. Hopefully a 5-star rating. You can find us anywhere you get your content. I think that's it. So let me run through the roadmap really quickly here, and then throw it to Tim before we get started. So we're gonna run through 4 main topics today. Number one, a few of these are stalwart topics that we cover often, and then we have a couple of new ones that we haven't hit on in a while. So number one is the sanctions that were rolled out and announced last week targeting Nord Stream 2, and we're going to talk about what that did and more to the point what that did not do and what that signals. We're going to check in on JCPOA 2.0 as we inch ever closer to perhaps having an agreement for the US and Iran to come back into compliance with the deal. We're going to check in once again on the CCMC list and Xiaomi about to get off the CCMC list, and then yet another lawsuit that has been brought to challenge a recent listing from January. And then the fourth and final topic in the main portion of the show is going to be a report that just came out last week on the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, and we're going to check in on that and just a few quick thoughts on that. We haven't touched on Hong Kong in a while, so we wanted to hit on that. And then in the lightning round, just 2 topics. Number one, we're going to look at ransomware. It's something we've talked about before in connection with the OFAC guidance, and then with the Colonial pipeline attack recently in the news. I think we wanted to just reflect on that briefly. And then finally, the sort of fairly astonishing events that happened in Belarus over the weekend with the Ryanair flight being diverted, some say hijacked, and a dissident journalist being pulled off, and what that may mean both from a sanctions perspective and perhaps more broadly going forward in the coming weeks and months with respect to Belarus and the regime there. So I think that's our show for today. Tim, any quick thoughts before we jump in, or?
No, a lot of the headlines are seeping their way into our show, at least the foreign policy headlines, and I think that is kind of where sanctions policy is. If it happens, there'll be sanctions. At least internationally.
Yeah, as we have noted time and again. But I think that's actually a good segue to topic number one, which is something we've talked about a lot over the last year plus is Nord Stream 2 and the U.S. response to Nord Stream 2 and the sanctions that are at least have been on the books with respect to Nord Stream 2 for quite some time. So last week, there was a report to Congress pursuant to the Protecting Europe's Energy Supply Act, PEESA, as we have been expecting, and that report was issued the middle of last week. And there were several individuals, entities, and vessels that were identified in that report that were identified as being subject to sanctions pursuant to PEESA. However, I think the most interesting piece here and what we want to spend most of our time talking about is what is not happening at the moment with respect to that report and the sanctions that can be levied with respect to Nord Stream 2 generally on the U.S. side. So number one, there's sort of two big aspects to this for people who have not been following. So number one, the report was issued by the State Department middle of last week, and at the same time, the State Department took great pains to make clear in its public statements accompanying the report that Nord Stream 2 AG, the company in charge of the project, and its CEO, who's a German national, as well as its senior executives, there were waivers being applied, national security waivers that were being applied with respect to the sanctions that could be or should have been imposed with respect to them under PEESA. So that's number one. There was a waiver, a pretty significant waiver with respect to the company and the senior executives. Number one. 2 days later, OFAC announced the additions of several entities and vessels that were implicated by that report to Congress on the non-SDN menu-based sanctions list. They were essentially all subject to blocking sanctions with a tiny carve-out relating to importation of goods that's provided for under the statute. But at the same time that those sanctions were announced, there was a general license that was issued with respect to Marine Rescue Service, which is a Russian entity that's the owner of most of the vessels, or at least it is the primary or at least secondary owner through its subsidiaries of most of the vessels that were implicated here. And there's a general license which essentially broadly permits U.S. person activities with MRS, as it is known, as long as they are not activities directly related to Nord Stream 2 project or Turk Stream, or that have to do with the vessels that are specifically listed on the non-SDN menu-based sanctions list. So at the end of the day, what we have is some sanctions that were announced and that were imposed. However, when you take a step back and look at all of this, it doesn't necessarily amount to much. And I will, before I turn to Tim, I will pat ourselves on the back a little bit for having kind of called this when we were thinking about this in January and February after PEESA was tweaked in the most recent NDAA legislation that was passed in early January. We sort of expected under a Biden administration that there was not going to be the stomach or it was going to be viewed as strategically distasteful or just not really possible to go hard after some of these entities because of the relationship, the U.S. relationship with Germany and other EU partners, wanting to kind of rebuild some of those bridges. And that is in fact exactly what has happened. Is there have been some sanctions imposed. They're really very targeted. There has been obviously the waivers that I already mentioned, and you've seen statements come out from the senior German officials kind of praising this action, and we're going to continue to work with the U.S. to hear their concerns. But this could have been very, if we were still under a Trump administration, potentially we could have seen something very over the top here that would have just thrown more gasoline on the fire and further strained relations with Germany and other EU partners. So that's kind of where we are. And of course, the U.S. is saying we're committed to stopping Nord Stream 2. We continue to be against the project. At the same time, they're also essentially admitting defeat in some ways, because there are now statements to the effect that the project's more than 90% complete. We expect it's going to be finished later this year. And I think this is a point we talked about before, which is, to what end would harsh sanctions have really worked here, given that the horse is somewhat out of the barn on the project. It's just very far down the road. There has been, quite frankly, I think there were plenty of authorities in place over the last several years where there could have been actions taken perhaps more aggressively, and the Trump administration just simply chose not to do that. In part because I think, as we've talked about a lot, there was not a lot of appetite to go hard after Russia in the last 4 years, and so I think they largely left this alone. Obviously, some members of Congress and others are wringing their hands and crying foul at the waivers and the general license and the sort of admission of defeat, waving of the white flag. But that's where we are at the moment. So that's kind of a quick summary of it all. Tim, let me throw it to you. This is, I know, a topic near and dear to your heart. So what do we make of all this, and what are your takeaways from this?
So I think the main takeaway is just what you were saying at the end there, Brian, and that is that you really have two differing philosophies of two different administrations. And so on the one hand, the Trump administration never really seemed to have the stomach to go after Russia on sanctions issues. And so despite the fact that Congress kept ramping up the sanctions on Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream, the Trump administration didn't even file a report. I mean, for long after the report was due under CATSA, the Trump administration didn't file a report on what was going on with respect to Nord Stream 2 for way until after the deadline. They really didn't impose serious sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, it was weird because on the one hand, as I think you just said, you had the Trump administration also had a very surprisingly acrimonious relationship with Germany. And so this was something that played to the Germans' benefit in some ways because the Germans wanted Nord Stream 2 and want Nord Stream 2. And so the Trump administration's kind of very soft, kind of weak attitude towards these sanctions was something that Germany liked. The Biden administration is kind of in the opposite position, and we're seeing them take an opposite direction, although it wasn't clear that would happen necessarily. So on the one hand, the Biden administration seems very determined to take a much tougher line with respect to what they view as Russian aggression. And in particular with Nord Stream 2, but in all sorts of other areas, I think they wanted to be more aggressive than the Trump administration was with respect to sanctions. However, the Biden administration took office wanting to rebuild relationships with allies like Germany that had been really, in their view, deteriorated significantly over the course of the Trump administration. And so you see that kind of tension playing out here where, the Biden administration imposes these sanctions under PEESA against Nord Stream and the highest corporate actors with respect to Nord Stream. So these are serious sanctions that if they were imposed and actually implemented, they could work. On the other hand, doing that was going to greatly antagonize our ally Germany, which I think in the Biden administration's view, we couldn't afford to antagonize now because relationships were not good. And so they decided to walk this line where they impose the sanctions, but then they lift them. Now, that tension is also inherent in CATSA. I mean, the original authorizing authority for this, I mean, now it's PEESA, but I think that tension is there in PEESA as well because these sanctions are imposed, but to the extent possible, the executive branch is supposed to work with our foreign allies on these. And right now, our foreign allies don't want these sanctions. So they kind of did what Congress told them to do, which was to impose the sanctions, but then listen to the allies who then told them to lift the sanctions. So they did. But it's really an odd position to be in because as a practical matter, this isn't much different than doing nothing.
Right. And obviously the waiver that you're referring to, I mean, that could obviously always be withdrawn or rescinded at any point. So there is kind of that still hanging over this whole proceeding. But at the same time, I just think this speaks to, again, something we've talked about a lot, which is what is the strategic purpose of the sanctions, right? And again, aggression for the sake of aggression with no real clear end game in mind and no real prospect of achieving success just doesn't seem to fit with the agenda of this administration. And I think that's more or less where they find themselves at the moment, with the additional issue, as you just pointed out, of burning bridges with Germany and other EU allies if we were to go hard here, and just essentially disregard the input of those other countries. So I just think that it does. This is about as crystal clear a demonstration of sort of that difference of approach. Now there is also, though, another sort of a flip side to this, which is, what are other allies such as, Ukraine, Poland, and others who probably, may have wanted harsher, more aggressive action. What are they going to think of this? They may not be very heartened by this development, but at the same time, to your point, you're trying to kind of contain and move aggressively against Russia certainly seems to be kind of a central focus of this administration. I just don't know that this is the avenue that we're going to really see that play out. I just think, again, 90+% complete. There's just it's sort of difficult at this point to say, unless there was really truly full commitment and the kind of the most aggressive targeted actions, which again would be purely unilateral at this point. I just don't know that there are sort of enough arrows in the quiver to stop and impede the project. So I think that's just an assessment that has been made, and then with the benefits of sort of going along in these ways and building some of that goodwill with the allies, I think that's kind of where we've netted out. And we'll see what happens over the course of the coming months, because if Congress is sufficiently upset about this, there could be more that gets thrown at the wall to see if there can be something else potentially imposed, or that the president's hands could be tied here. But I'm not sure where else they go at this point, before this is all over.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we'll probably talk about it in a number of the segments today, but I think this is a good example of the limits of sanctions. Because, sanctions really since Afghanistan and Iraq, have bogged down and become kind of certainly not success stories in terms of the use of military in foreign policy. Sanctions have become the tool of choice, the bipartisan tool of choice for pretty much every foreign policy crisis. And, as we've talked about, and I think you were just talking about there, Brian, sanctions work best when they're multilateral and when you have a defined purpose. Now here they would have had a defined purpose. So stopping Nord Stream 2 is a defined purpose for sanctions. But I think when you're trying to stop an overseas project from completion, it is a limited goal, but it's one that's very hard to accomplish if you don't have the allies, and particularly one of the parties to that agreement there, who's really in on the project. And in fact, if they're opposing the project, it becomes almost impossible.
Also, too little too late. Again, just the timing. If we're looking at sort of where we are now versus where perhaps the U.S. could have been if things had played out differently 2 years ago, maybe, or 3 years ago, perhaps we're in a different situation. But we, again, 90% plus complete. And I think just sort of playing the cards that we've been dealt, I think that has dictated how they want to play this out here. So, no, I agree with you. So, actually, that's a good segue. Let's leave Nord Stream 2 behind. Obviously, we'll keep our eyes on whether there's any blowback from this or any further developments. But let's pivot to one of our favorite topics. I'm sure by the time this goes up, quite frankly, there could be a change to what the latest and greatest is here. But let me throw it to Tim and just sort of a quick check-in on the discussions regarding JCPOA 2.0.
The JCPOA 2.0 discussion has a lot of the themes that we've just been talking about in connection with Nord Stream. That is that we have very differing views from administration to administration. So the Trump administration obviously withdrew the U.S. from the nuclear deal. The Biden administration is trying to put us back in the nuclear deal. The Trump administration put up a huge number of hurdles to getting back into the nuclear deal because they really changed the lay of the land. And in response to the Trump administration changing the lay of the land, Iran changed the lay of the land by restarting its nuclear program, since in its view, it wasn't getting the benefits of the deal, so it wasn't going to live up to its end of the deal either. And so, we've been talking about this now for months, and there are negotiations that are going on in Vienna, and the latest round took place last week. And I will say that I was struck by the reports coming out from both sides, although mostly from the Europeans, and to some extent the Iranians. But then the reports from the U.S. actually were also pretty optimistic. I mean, all the way around. I think some more than others, but it sounds to me like the outline of a deal may be there at this point, and that when the two sides return to Vienna in the next couple of weeks, that they may be there to try and finalize a deal. We could be getting that close.
Yeah, and I believe they're actually back this week, if I'm not mistaken. I think again we're in the final week of May here, and a couple of dates to bear in mind: the Iranian election, June 18th, the extension of the IAEA's monitoring agreement with Iran extended till the end of June, till June 24th. That's a big deal. That just got announced yesterday. There was some fear that perhaps that was going to fall through, and there was going to be kind of a blind spot for some number of days or weeks with respect to monitoring. That has been renewed, been extended. So that is, for anybody who's handicapping this, I think that is a positive sign that there could very well be a deal reached. But I do think that the way this is all being reported, and again, as Tim said, if you look at the statements coming out of Iran, it sounds like they basically already have an agreement in place, which nobody's willing to. I think nobody on the U.S. side and on the European side is quite willing to say that yet. But it does seem like they're getting close. It does seem like this could be imminent, like there could be an announcement of a framework or some broad bullet points of what the agreement is going to look like to get the U.S. and Iran back into compliance, back into the deal any day now, quite frankly. And I think this is all along we've kind of been looking at the Iranian election as kind of a marker, a key marker, and we were expecting that if something's going to get done and sorted out, it probably would be slightly in advance of that, and that's where we are. We're basically 3 weeks away from that now, and so I think that any day now we could see this, and as Tim said, I think all signs are pointing toward there is going to be a deal. The U.S. is presumably going to agree to roll back and remove many of the obstacles that they put in place over the last couple of years to drastically expand the types of sanctions and just the sheer number of designations that were imposed with respect to Iran. And so, again, just kind of a quick check-in here. I don't know that we have too much more to say on it at the moment, but it is such a centrally vital and important issue in this ecosystem that I think we can't help but kind of continue to check in on it on a regular basis. Any sort of further or final thoughts on that, Tim, before we?
Yeah, I mean, I think for people who are watching, there's really three key issues as I see it. I mean, one is, how is the U.S. going to essentially deal with the sanctions imposed by the Trump administration? And that's come out in the media. It's basically going to be a test of, are these consistent with or inconsistent with kind of the underlying deal of the JCPOA. But, that's a great test. I'm guessing that there are some sticking points, and maybe they've resolved those. But, can they figure out what sanctions the U.S. is going to lift? Because it's going to have to look different than the JCPOA. And we've talked about that a lot. I mean, I think the second point is going to be, how do you deal with the fact that the JCPOA basically was not in play for about 3 years, meaning that, the timelines that are in the JCPOA are in some sense obsolete, or certainly too short from the U.S. perspective. And so how do you deal with that? I think that is going to be, a big issue from the U.S. side, apart from kind of which sanctions is the U.S. willing to lift as being inconsistent with the deal. And then I think the third thing is going to be, what do we do about the Iranian, changing of the status quo? From Iran's perspective, they added new centrifuges that were not allowed under the deal, but that were put in at a time when their view, and it's not an unreasonable view, they were not in a deal. They were not in a nuclear deal. They weren't bound by the nuclear deal because the other side had breached. And so I guess the question there is kind of what is Iran going to be willing to do with respect to the centrifuges, and what can the U.S. live with? And I've seen all sorts of reports on that. But I think those are the three key issues that may have been solved last week. But I think as you watch the reporting, to me, those are the three things that I'd be looking for, is kind of how much noise is there on those three issues, because I think those are what they need to resolve in order to get to a deal. I guess to add one fourth issue, the financial channels. The Iranians were very dissatisfied, even under the JCPOA, with the ability to get payment. And I think, I haven't heard really anything about the details of how that is going to be changed. I haven't seen anything from the reporting, but I have seen reporting that it is a big issue, and I believe that, because I think that from the Iranian side was probably the biggest focus of dissatisfaction before the U.S. withdrew.
Yeah, on that last item, obviously we've talked about that quite a lot. Would expect that is going to be a central issue. I mean, to your point, it'll be interesting to see how much is truly kind of in this agreement, whatever this agreement ends up looking like, this preliminary agreement, versus how much gets punted in terms of the sort of finer details, because I think there are a lot of finer details that are going to need to be sorted out before this is all completed. But the time pressure now, again, with the Iranian elections and some of these other elements swirling around, I think is probably, we may be in that kind of perfect storm right now where there's enough momentum and enough incentives on all sides to get something, at least this first wave of an agreement done, and then we'll see where we go from there. So obviously we'll be back to that before too long, likely on the next episode, but we did want to just sort of check in and touch base again on that. So moving to item number 3, another stalwart favorite topic of ours, which is the Communist Chinese military company list, and checking back in on some of the entities that have challenged their listing, and in particular Xiaomi. So announcement, or the public court filing just a few days ago made clear two big developments with Xiaomi. Number one, the government is not going to take an appeal from the preliminary injunction that was entered in that case in DC Federal District Court, which I think we predicted. We did not think that was going to happen. We said the exact same thing with respect to Lukong when we talked about that last episode. I would imagine that the same is going to be true for them when this becomes ripe in a few weeks in that case. So Xiaomi, no appeal, and the government has agreed to an order vacating the designation of Xiaomi as a CCMC, and so that is now sitting with the court, and the court presumably is going to sign off on that, and then Xiaomi will come off the CCMC list. So it looks like we're headed toward total victory for Xiaomi. Again, I think we expect Lukong will likely play out in the same way, now that we have sort of a path, an exit strategy, or a path out of designation here in the wake of a preliminary injunction. And then the other interesting thing to note that's related is there was another suit that was just filed a couple of days ago, late last week, by GoWin, which is a semiconductor company, interestingly founded by U.S. persons, although headquartered in China, not actually publicly traded. So if you look at just, I'm sure we will come back to this when in this case is also going in front of Judge Contreras in DC. So I think the betting markets would probably not give very good odds that you're going to get different results than we saw in the first two cases. But there is one wrinkle that's a little different, which is that aspect I just mentioned. It's a privately held company, not a public company. So the nature of the harm is somewhat different than what you saw in the other two cases. However, in the underlying arguments are all the same, that the APA arguments are all the same, that there was, don't meet the definition of a CCMC, there was no substantial evidentiary basis for the finding, et cetera. So it is literally going to be Groundhog Day, I think, for DOJ if they are forced to defend this, and DOD doesn't decide to just cut bait on this before they go through this again. And so, but the aspect where it is not a publicly traded company, they indicated perhaps at some point in the future they may want to have an IPO. They also hang a lot on the fact that they're just the public stigma of being identified as a CCMC has already cost them a significant amount of business, which is not surprising. We see this all the time, and so I think that's essentially the irreparable harm that they're pointing to in their suit. So it is a slightly different, but the underlying legal basis for the PI would be essentially identical to what we've seen in Xiaomi and Luokong. So anyway, that's kind of where we are again on sort of the weekly update on CCMC litigation. So just let me throw it to Tim for any additional thoughts on either Xiaomi coming off the list or GoWin's new suit.
Well, let's start with Xiaomi. I mean, I think that is a recognition from the administration and from DOJ that Judge Contreras was right about the term affiliated. I mean, they don't think they can beat Luokong or in court, or Xiaomi in court, and so they've decided not to appeal and to settle, basically. And maybe they're looking for a better set of facts, but I can tell you, I just don't think this was an issue that the SG wanted to take up to the circuit, and so I think that sounds like it's over. I assume the same result will happen in Luokong. The irreparable harm issue here is a little bit different in the GoWin case, so we'll see. They certainly are going to win on the likelihood of success on the merits, and they probably alleged enough to get over the bar on irreparable harm. But the fact that they're not publicly traded, and the executive order really creating the biggest consequence of this is the fact that really relates to publicly traded shares. That this one could be a little bit closer, but we'll see, because I do think that the damage, the financial damage from being on this list is probably significant, and if they got it wrong, just like they got it wrong with Luokong and Xiaomi in terms of whether GoWin belongs on the list, I would think that's going to be enough to get them over the bar. So I think we'll probably be talking in a few weeks about the preliminary injunction in the GoWin case as well.
Yeah, that would be my guess, but we shall see. It is a little bit of a different dimension to this whole discussion that we haven't really looked at before, but one that we'll keep our eye on. And again, that case was just filed. So look, I also would not be shocked if perhaps DOJ sits down with the folks at DOD and perhaps other stakeholders in the government and just says, do we really want to go through this again, or do you want to reconsider whether you want to just take them off? Now that may set a dangerous precedent, because any company who gets put on this list may feel like, well, as long as I bring a lawsuit, they'll let me out. But at the same time, given the record or the lack of a record that apparently exists for any of these listings, this is an uphill battle, regardless of the slightly different nature of the harm that might be alleged. So we'll see, but that'll be something that we'll obviously be keeping our eyes on, because this is pretty fascinating to see how this is now playing out here in the
yeah. I mean, I think
after.
One thing that hopefully both DOD and OFAC and Treasury will learn from all of this is that the list is an overreach. And so to the extent there are companies out there like Xiaomi, like Luokong, presumably like GoWin, with cases that they're not really affiliated with the Chinese military, except in the sense that, all private companies might be affiliated with the military of whatever country they sit in. Those companies shouldn't have been on the list, and presumably they'll be taken off, and presumably there won't be listings like that. Now, I do think there's a limit to these lawsuits, because there are companies that are on that list that likely are affiliated with the Chinese military in any sense, meaningful sense of the term. And so those companies are, in my view, unlikely to bring suit, because they're going to, expose themselves potentially to discovery on this issue, and or to a much stronger administrative record on those sorts of issues that might be much more compelling and meets those definitions. So I think that's where the limit to these suits are, but so far we haven't reached it, because we're seeing new companies each week show up with what appear to be pretty strong cases that they shouldn't have been on the list.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, so we'll keep our eye on that. And if any companies are out there that want to take a shot at this, give me and Tim a call.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. We're ready to
and then
litigate.
and then with that, let's go to the final topic for the main portion of the show, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act report that just came out last week, and I'll throw that to Tim.
Yeah. One of the laws that Congress passed last year that we've talked about on the podcast, and then a law that dates back to 1992, does require continuing reports from the Secretary of State about the level of autonomy that is being exercised in Hong Kong, because that level of autonomy implicates a number of different trade and other laws that at least until recently, often treated Hong Kong as different from China, because Hong Kong had different sorts of, democratic processes, different sorts of laws that were implied with the trade law, an independent judiciary, some form of democracy and democratic representation. And so Congress, when it's passed these laws that really focus on Hong Kong autonomy, has required the Secretary of State to do a report to Congress periodically. And the report was done, I think, about a week ago from the Secretary of State, updating Congress as to where Hong Kong's autonomy is currently. And I mean, the bad news is that it's not good. I mean, Hong Kong, the national security law that China passed in June of 2020 has really clamped down on the ability of Hong Kong's legislative council to act. They have postponed elections, at least nominally because of COVID. But we had an election during COVID, and more people came out to vote than ever before, and it was a safe election and a fair and free election. And so the fact that we could hold those elections during COVID, when our outbreak was much worse last fall than was going on in Hong Kong, suggests that the explanation for suspending the elections for a year may not have really been about COVID. And that shows up in the report as well. And so the report basically, all the way through talks about just how much democratic institutions in Hong Kong have been limited, how bad the criminal legal system is in Hong Kong in terms of arrests, bail, investigations, proceedings. And it's overall just kind of a depressing report in connection with Hong Kong and the level of autonomy. Now, it doesn't really, and it does also kind of update Congress on the number of sanctions that have been imposed. Nothing new. We talked about it on on one of the previous podcasts about the Biden administration coming in and imposing, I think it was 30 some SDN designations under the Hong Kong sanctions program against individuals that OFAC and the Biden administration thought were responsible for undermining the autonomy of Hong Kong. But there's been nothing new since then. And this report really just kind of summarizes the state of things. It doesn't really break any new ground. And so bottom line, it's depressing. The one area that seemed not to be depressing was in there's still some limited measure of autonomy and the rule of law with respect to property rights, but even there was some hedging about how great that was.
Yeah, I really only want to make one additional point here, which is foreign financial institutions. So when this program was stood up last year, when the executive order came out, and when this legislation was passed, and in the wake of some of the prior legislation, I believe, said on this podcast, certainly to one another in separate conversation, whether or not this sanctions program makes any difference in terms of deterring any kind of anti-democratic or the sort of human rights related concerning conduct that is targeted here, would all come down to the banks and foreign financial institutions, as it often does with respect to OFAC sanctions programs. And the report here from OFAC essentially says, now for the second time since last year's new reporting requirement came out, that there have been no foreign financial institutions identified that have engaged in significant transactions with persons identified pursuant to these reports to Congress, with persons that are subject to sanctions. As Tim said, there are a few dozen individuals, mostly Chinese and Hong Kong government officials, who have been sanctioned under the program since last year. And in some ways, it's perhaps not that surprising that there's no foreign financial institutions who would um, stick their necks out to perhaps help those folks evade sanctions or to continue, um, perhaps undeterred in the way that they are able to sort of transact business or access the financial markets. But I do think that there's some kind of rote recitations about, well, we looked at classified and unclassified reporting and information relating to this. We'll continue to review that. I have a legitimate question, which is, you know, I don't know that it's entirely clear sort of how closely Treasury or anybody in the US government has been looking for those kinds of potential significant transactions. As we know, when the US government decides to put its resources in and focus on certain topics or issues, it can often dredge up quite a bit. And so it could be that all foreign financial institutions in connection with Hong Kong and China who are having any dealings with these persons, or they're having no dealings with these persons anymore, perhaps, are entirely clean. Another question is, what type of efforts have been exerted here? Will there be any increase in those efforts to try to, you know, sniff out any potential violators or any potential significant transactions? I don't know. I mean, this is always the sort of significant transaction, threshold is, as we know from having had many, many, many discussions with clients about this over the years, is that's something that's oftentimes a purely internal sort of analysis that I'm sure banks and others that are connected, that are in the FFI bucket are doing right now with respect to some of these persons who are implicated or are sanctioned under this program. And you just there's the idea that there would be, I guess, a real universe of information that you could mine to understand or find those things is hard. It's hard to imagine. I think these are sort of purely internal discussions and debates and exercises and decisions that are often taken that lead to some of these things. And for something to kind of bubble up externally to actually give clues to the fact that there was something going on with a foreign financial institution with respect to any number of these individuals would be frankly pretty surprising. I don't know how you would get at that from a kind of investigative or a monitoring standpoint, but I think it's an interesting question. And I think, we may be just in this, we're just kind of on this path, and this is I would be shocked unless there's some change in strategy that there would be some FFIs that are found to have engaged in significant transactions, unless somebody does something monumentally stupid that ends up being publicized all over the place, or there's a change in approach by the U.S. in terms of what they're trying to actually investigate here. So I don't know, just sort of that's sort of there's the big thing that kind of occurred to me because these frankly this program just doesn't have much in the way of teeth if we don't have adequate focus on that aspect of it. And perhaps deterrence is 100% uniform and nobody is engaging in these transactions at the moment. I have a hard time believing that that's the case, but I don't know. We'll maybe time will tell. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that before we move on.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think you're exactly right, Brian, that is the biggest hammer in this toolbox for the Hong Kong sanctions and often for any sanctions program. But here it really is going to make the difference in terms of whether this program has any meaningful effect. On that, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I seriously doubt that anybody on this list is doing business in dollars. So it's going to be a little bit harder for the U.S. financial system to catch this when the currencies and the transactions are not at least being routed through the U.S. I mean, I think second, I suspect that the Hong Kong financial institutions view enforcement very differently than the PRC financial
the mainland China financial institutions.
And so I would suspect that a lot of the people on the list are no longer doing business in Hong Kong dollars because the Hong Kong dollar is tied to the US dollar. The Hong Kong financial community is kind of closer to the U.S. and
certainly to the Western financial
to the
community
Western
with the UK ties and otherwise. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
And so I suspect that what's likely happened as a result of this is that for the people who and entities that have been put on the list, they are doing their business exclusively now through Chinese financial institutions in RMB or some, non-US, non-Hong Kong, probably non-Euro denomination that or currency that is unlikely to be spotted in terms of a transaction. So if there are significant transactions out there, this report says they haven't seen any, but if they are out there, they're likely in places that it would be very hard for the U.S. to find.
Right. No, agree with that. And it'll be interesting to just see if there's any more intel that bubbles up on this, or again, if we do see at some point that there's a red line cross, there's some actor or some FFI that does kind of get crosswise with these restrictions, but for the time being, it is a null set. So we will continue to keep our eyes on that, and we just thought an interesting kind of check in again on that, since we haven't talked about Hong Kong in a little while. Okay, so with that, we're wrapped up with the main portion of the program. We're flying through, given our typical pace, and we have just 2 topics to hit on in the lightning round. The first is ransomware, and as I alluded to at the outset, the Colonial pipeline ransomware attack. For anybody who's not following this outside the U.S., this has been major news. Gas prices, gas supply, certainly all up and down the East Coast, massively affected by this over the last couple of weeks. And it has been reported that the company did in fact pay a ransom of over $4 million to obtain its data back. That was locked up by this ransomware attack. Also, interestingly, part of the reason this kind of caught our eye for this episode too, there was a report just a few days ago as well that CNA, the large insurance company, also paid a ransom, an even larger ransom, reported to be $40 million with in connection with a ransomware attack that had been launched earlier this year. So 2 very sort of high profile ransom, and these are by no stretch are these the only ones. I don't want to minimize this. Ransomware attacks are sort of at an epidemic level at this point. There's a new cybersecurity EO that was just issued by the president last week. That is in part aimed at sort of getting at this issue, but that's also largely kind of government focused. These are private actors, obviously. And so what we want to come back to is OFAC's ransomware guidance from last year, which we talked about at the time. We actually just wrote something on this just recently, Tim and I and our team, and then the actions that we just saw, which are 2 companies paying substantial ransoms, as has been reported. So it's just interesting because the government does not take the position, certainly, of encouraging private parties to pay ransoms. And I think the OFAC guidance, which was issued last October, sort of doubles down on that. And the guidance from OFAC, if you recall, for those who haven't looked at it in a while, this was not really aimed. It was aimed to some degree at victim companies, but it was more aimed at kind of the ransomware payment industry, if you will, which is to say financial institutions, money processing, payment processors, cyber insurance providers, those in the crypto space, whether it be wallets or other providers in the crypto space that may be involved, because as reported, the Colonial payment was in Bitcoin, which I've also seen some people gleefully point out the value of the Bitcoin is probably a fraction of what it was at the time the ransom was paid, just given that Bitcoin has kind of gone down the drain. Yeah.
Hope they unloaded those 75 Bitcoin.
Yeah, those Eastern European or Russian hackers who were behind the Colonial pipeline, hopefully they had good financial advisors. But all kidding aside, but I think the interesting question here is this. This is what I want to sort of tee up just quickly for Tim to consider, for us to consider, which is So OFAC essentially says in its guidance, like, look, beware if you're involved in one of these payments, if you facilitate one of these payments, if you make one of these payments, um, then and you're dealing with a sanctioned country, if you're dealing with North Korea, Iran, someone acting in Crimea, someplace else. If you're dealing with an SDN, if you're dealing with a blocked person, or and increasingly there are more of these malicious cyber actors that have been subject to sanctions under the Cyber EO and other executive orders, and even if you do so unwittingly, not knowing at the time that they are, it's strict liability standard. You could be on the hook for sanctions penalties, potentially for penalties pursuant to whatever program it is that you may be violating. Now, I want to point out this little nugget that is in the guidance, and then throw it to Tim, because I do think that based on the public statements that have been made by both Colonial and CNA, this seems to be critical. And I do think that this is something for sort of food for thought for anybody out there who's hopefully you won't have to deal with this, or you haven't had to deal with this, but for anybody who's sitting at a company or advising a company that may have to deal with the question of, well, do we pay the ransom? Do we not pay the ransom? Let's be honest. When it comes down to we think we need to pay the ransom, or we cannot operate, and there are just too many sort of bad consequences that flow from that, I think companies, by and large, come out on the side of let's pay the ransom and take the risk. But if, to the extent that you are trying to assess the risk of on the sanction side of things, here's just a quick snippet from the OFAC guidance. Under OFAC's enforcement guidelines, OFAC will also consider a company's self-initiated, timely, and complete report of a ransomware attack to law enforcement to be a significant mitigating factor in determining an appropriate enforcement outcome if the situation is later determined to have a sanctions nexus. OFAC will also consider a company's full and timely cooperation with law enforcement both during and after a ransomware attack to be a significant mitigating factor when evaluating a possible enforcement outcome. So, just quickly, no company likes to talk about this publicly. Nobody wants to acknowledge this. Nobody wants to talk about whether they're talking to law enforcement or cooperating with law enforcement. I know this very well from having been on the other side of this, and then having advised companies who also don't want to be doing this from the other side. However, if you read between the lines of the statements that are being made by these companies, they're very clear. We were in touch with OFAC. We were in touch with the FBI. We were essentially abiding by this paragraph. We were abiding by these rules, putting it out there like, don't hammer us if down the road it turns out we were dealing with actors in a jurisdiction we were not allowed to be dealing with, or that they turned out to have been blocked, right? And so I think that is fundamentally a big that is a big decision. Is if you're going to pay the ransom, do you precede that, or do you accompany that with the outreach to OFAC, FBI, Secret Service, whomever it is within the sort of federal government network of cyber security, protectors and actors and investigators? Do you do that? And it seems here that that's partially the playbook that was relied upon by these actors. And I think, again, from all the discussions that I've had on this topic, that is a pretty good sort of counterbalance and insurance card. There's no guarantees. Obviously, the government would never say, OFAC would never say, you get a free pass, because they would not want to incentivize bad actors. They would not want to incentivize companies from just kind of willy-nilly paying ransoms without having to think about this. However, the language I just read is about as clear as it gets from the government in terms of saying, if you do this, we're not going to be seeing a web notice coming after these companies 2 years from now, 3 years from now. I would be willing to bet my life in connection with these payments, because of the cooperation, because of the notice, and because of the transparency that they've given to the government. So that's just some thoughts on that. But let me throw it to Tim to add to that, if anything.
Well, just a couple things. That's been my experience, is that when a company has a ransomware attack and then they cooperate with the government, that the government is not going to not only is the government not going to stop them from making the payment, they're gonna understand. And here, with Colonial, you can see that from the government's perspective, the idea of having the entire East Coast pipeline shut down or paying a $4 million ransom, I think the government was probably pretty happy that Colonial decided to pay the ransom as well. It does create sanctions issues. OFAC is right about that, although I have to say, having tried to look at them from the other end, they're very tough to navigate because the people that you're making the payment to generally are not giving you enough information to run a real, a good electronic name screen. And they're not advertising that they are in a sanctioned jurisdiction because they're trying not to tell you where they are. So it's not the easiest thing in the world in terms of navigating sanctions and making these payments. I think it's basically you do what you can has mostly been my advice. You do your best, but at the end of the day, you're probably not going to get a lot of clarity, and you're just going to have to kind of do what you need to do and then apologize later, as opposed to trying to get permission, because it just isn't going to happen. I mean, obviously, if you know somebody's on the SDN list or this is coming from a sanctioned jurisdiction, the analysis would be different, but usually you don't. The other thing that I would say about, kind of going forward, especially in light of President Biden's new executive order, is that I could see that order making it more difficult to make these payments. And I don't know if that's an intended consequence of that order, because let's just say that the government feels confident enough in whomever did the most recent attack, Colonial attack, and they put that company on the SDN list, and that company does another attack of similar size. Now you know that you can't make the payment. I mean, a lot of these groups that are known for these attacks are not on any sort of list. If they do go on a list, then it does make it, you have the issue that OFAC has identified. And so you might want to make the payment, but you can't make the payment. Now, would OFAC give you a license to make the payment? Well, if they do, then what's the point in putting them on the list, and the company that is doing this stuff on the list in the first place, if OFAC will give you an immediate license to make the payment? So I do think in terms of the utility of sanctions to really stop this sort of behavior, I think that it may not be all that useful, because it just gets in the way of what companies want to do. Now, if there's some way you could stop the attacks in the first place, that would be a lot better, but I'm not sure sanctions is the right tool for that either.
Yeah, just a couple of quick final thoughts. So again, I think there's a distinct difference between sort of re-victimizing the victims, the companies that are actually subject to these attacks, as opposed to, again, the sort of all of the ancillary parties that are involved, again, cyber insurance, payment processors, sort of cyber due diligence and intelligence firms and the like that are involved here, who may be in a better position theoretically to have knowledge as to who these actors are, where they're coming from, and all those types of things. So I do think there is a distinction there. And then to the point you just made, Tim, these sort of hacker outfits and some of these individuals are obviously not going to be necessarily well known at the time that these things come in. Attack happens. It may be a lag time of days or weeks before they're identified, or again, it's usually a cyber kind of intelligence shop or cybersecurity firm that's going to do that, whether contracted by the victim company or otherwise. And so there's always going to be a little bit of a lag there. And you're right that if you got in a position where you knew it was somebody who was subject to sanctions and you felt like you had no choice, would OFAC sort of immediately grant kind of an emergency specific license? I don't know. That's an interesting question. Obviously, that balance between deterrence and allowing victim companies in particular to be able to try to navigate what's just a dreadfully difficult situation is a situation fraught with risk from all dimensions, not just the sanctions dimension, is a very tricky thing. So in any event, I think we just wanted to flag that because it's a couple of very high profile examples that just came up recently, made us kind of think back to the guidance and just wanted to kind of put that out there. So we'll leave that behind for now. I'm sure we may come back to that sadly in the future, but let's bring it back. Let's wrap up with our final story, which is a little crazy and a little unexpected coming out of Belarus.
Yeah, this just happened in the past few days, and I think from a sanctions perspective, we're going to wait and see what happens. But I don't think we could ignore what happened in Belarus. You had a dissident journalist who had apparently been doing some very effective work, so effective that got the attention of President Lukashenko and the personal attention of President Lukashenko. And so when this gentleman and his girlfriend were on a flight, I mean, he's a young kid. I mean, he's 26 years old. He's on a flight from Athens, I think, to Lithuania, and they were in Belarusian airspace. They were intercepted by the Belarusian military, by some fighter jets under the pretext that there was some sort of bomb threat that has now since been shown to be a pretext, as I understand it. And he was, and there were also apparently Belarusian security agents on the plane. So this was definitely a pre-planned operation. And they escorted him off the plane, and then the plane was forced to land in Minsk. The dissident journalists and the presumed Belarusian KGB agents, because that's what they call their secret service, escorted him off the plane, and then the plane was allowed to continue on to Lithuania. Now, as I understand it, the EU's response has been pretty fast and in some ways strong, because it has immediately imposed sanctions, and there's been discussion of no overflights, essentially banning the Belarusian national airline from flying to other EU jurisdictions. But I have to say, I mean, this was kind of a shocking demonstration of just a complete disregard for international norms and flight safety and all sorts of things in terms of what Lukashenko was willing to do to defy all sorts of different countries in violation of international law. And sanctions are coming, and the U.S. already has a sanctions program with respect to Belarus. We talked about it on, I think, the last couple of shows, how the U.S. has been strengthening in light of other kind of contra-norm behavior from that regime. But the question in my mind is, apart from sanctions, what can really be done about this? And I really do think this is an issue that sanctions are slow, and when you have kind of a determined leader at the top that just doesn't care about the consequences, like this one appears not to, and we'd already been ramping up sanctions on him when he did this, is this, I'll throw it back to you, Brian. I mean, is this an area where sanctions is just not the right tool? I mean, and in my mind, there would be other sorts of foreign policy tools that probably would be more effective than sanctions here, although the EU's already imposed them, and I assume the US will probably follow.
Yeah, it's an interesting quandary. I think obviously recently we were talking about the general license that is now going away with respect to the Belarusian state-owned entities in light of exactly this type of behavior, which is cracking down on dissidents, journalists, etc., by Lukashenko and imprisoning them. This is obviously a fairly dramatic escalation of that to pull off an operation of this magnitude and visibility for the whole world to see, and to really double down on the efforts to consolidate power and to isolate and imprison and go after enemies of the regime. And so clearly there are going to be sanctions coming from the US that are going to be targeted at least the people directly involved here. The EU sanctions so far, I don't know how effective those are going to be. They seem to be relatively light in the grand scheme of things. Whether because there is at least some kind of multilateral consensus here, perhaps if there could be a meeting of the minds between US and EU partners as to how they would want to go about this, what they would want to do. I mean, the clear goal here, as it is in many of these programs, is to force free and fair elections. I think ultimately, with respect to Lukashenko and his regime, as a first step, obviously, to get the sort of the opposition parties released from captivity in Belarus, and then to force free and fair elections. Obviously, it seems like we are creeping farther and farther away from that, not closer to that. So what does that mean? What's the end game there? What other strategies can there be? I think, as Tim just said, unclear sort of how effective sanctions might be. Obviously, also to the extent that, my understanding of sort of the Belarus-Russian relationship is that is that is sort of hashtag complicated. So unclear sort of how this Lukashenko and Putin uh, would how much Putin or the Russians would want to come to the aid of Belarus to the extent that they're sort of sticking a finger in the eye of the West here. That's another kind of wild card, unclear how that'll all play out. But I think uh, things are perhaps taking a turn for the more, I don't want to say interesting in a cavalier sort of way, but really unclear sort of how this proceeds from here, because this does just strike me as a fairly astonishing kind of turn of events. The State Department, of course, was quick to note that there were U.S. citizens on this flight that was taken down in Minsk, and so to the extent that U.S. U.S. citizens were sort of imperiled by this action, then I think that also kind of just underscores the resolve in all likelihood of the U.S. to do something decisive here. But we'll have to see. Unclear. It's so fresh, unclear what's coming, but certainly something will be coming in the next couple days or weeks.
Well, I mean, this is just such a frightening method of kind of enforcing the deprivation of human rights norms. I mean, planes fly all over the world. I mean, lots of planes fly over Russia, for example. I mean, if this becomes if the world has an ineffectual response to this, this can eat. There are other dictators out there who are watching, who are thinking, hey, I mean, I really would like to get a hold of dissidents who I can't easily get at. I might start downing planes over Russia, for example, just to take one example, pulling people out of the planes that I don't like, and nobody can really stop me. And I if it doesn't end here, I don't think it's going to get any better, to be quite honest.
Right. Yeah, it is a dangerous slippery slope, and it's some yeah, and so we're going to have to see where it does go from here. But pretty frightening, quite frankly. But we'll have to keep an eye on this. Not in keeping with the trend of, again, sort of more kind of anti-democratic leaders that have seemingly been emboldened kind of around the world uh, to step up and sort of conduct themselves without fear of reprisal. We'll see if there's any reprisal here. So whether it's sanctions or otherwise, but yeah, it's something clearly to keep an eye on. This has been kind of front page news, obviously, for the past few days, and I expect that it will continue to be for at least the foreseeable future. So with that, I think we're wrapped for today. That was, as we said at the outset, a fairly tidy episode. We wanted to just run through those topics and perhaps set ourselves up for a few bigger issues that are likely coming. I'm sure that if we do get a JCPOA announcement and details there, we may very well have to dedicate an entire episode just to that if we do get that in the next few weeks. So we'll have to see. But in the meantime, that's our final episode for May. As we said, if you're in the States, we hope that you are about to or have just enjoyed a nice Memorial Day weekend, and that everybody out there, of course, stay safe, stay sanctions free, and we will catch everybody next time. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and Trudeau would like to thank us for getting to appear as a guest on this episode. So you're welcome, Trudeau.
Tim's dog will be featured as a guest in the promotion of this episode. So please feel free to give him a like on Twitter or to reach out and get his Instagram handle, because it's a good follow. So anyway,
All right. Stay sanctions free, everybody.
stay sanctions free, everyone. Thanks. Bye.